I'm Ann Pisor. I'm a scientific anthropologist. I have an evolutionary bent. And what that means is that basically I'm doing a lot of integrative work, so qualitative work, quantitative work. I do theory, I do empiricism. I also do work on basically the mind and studying the philosophy of the mind a little bit. And so even though I won't be talking about it today, if you are in fact interested in philosophy, want to chat with me a little bit more later about one of these papers, including this bottom one, which we are preparing for submission right now, I'm happy to chat more with you. So to get us started, I'd like to talk to you about two different countries where ethnic group identity looms large. And these also happen to be two countries in which I've done research. So the first one is Bolivia, and yeah, doing the research right there, as you can see. In Bolivia, in the 2010s, ethnic identity loomed large. It was strong in the political discourse. This was the time when the country was really leaning into a plurinational identity of different pueblos indígenas, and it was very much part of how resources were structured and how people were thinking about themselves. And what was really key here, and I'm going to come back to this, is that the government itself was using indigenous status to allocate resources to different groups. So we'll come back to that in a few minutes. I also now work in Kenya. And in Kenya in the 2020s, even though the government isn't explicitly de jure focused on allocating resources by ethnic identity, de facto that's what happens. And so ethnic identity continues to loom large. Now, something that's also interesting as well is that in Bolivia, even though you do have some ethnic tensions, they do not usually spill over into intergroup violence, but they definitely do where I work in northern Kenya. And so the question that has animated many people in my area of anthropology and evolutionary anthropology is, why does animosity occur between human groups? Why do we get intergroup conflict? Why do we get intergroup violence? And this is something we think about both in terms of, as evolutionary anthropologists, what we're often thinking about is the evolution of the mind. We're thinking about the evolution of sociality for humans, so our social life, and also the evolution of even human bodies. And so the kinds of questions we're asking when we're thinking about animosity between human groups is we're thinking about things like, why does it happen? When does it happen? What factors may increase or decrease intergroup conflict for us now, but also thinking back for our ancestors, for human ancestors? And do the same factors that we've seen before come into play today in the 2020s? And so today, I only have a brief amount of time with y'all, but I want to take a bit of a 30,000-foot view here. I want to talk to you a bit about how we've been thinking about a couple key questions in evolutionary anthropology. I will mostly talk about my work today, but happy to chat more about other things we've been doing afterwards. We'll talk a little bit about what actually is a group. We'll talk a bit about what predicts increases and decreases in intergroup conflict, again, very much from the 30,000-foot view. So we can think about examples of that, but we'll think about kind of these larger patterns. And then we'll talk briefly about future directions for interdisciplinary work on intergroup dynamics, including some kind of ethical tensions we're dealing with there, which I'll come back to as a discussant here in just a little bit. So what I'd like to do first is tackle this first question, what is a group? And I think this is actually something that matters for us quite a bit if we're doing theoretical work, if we're doing empirical work at actually defining what groups are. And as you'll see for me, this actually matters quite a bit in thinking about humans and intergroup conflict. So you may have noticed when I was talking about groups in Bolivia and in Kenya that I was focused on ethnic groups. Now, anthropologists have thought quite a bit about what an ethnic group is. Some of y'all may also have done some of this work. It's happening across the social sciences, but usually it refers to individuals who often identify as having a shared ancestor, shared ancestry. Additionally, you often see shared norms, so ways for doing things. I'll use Douglas North's approach to norms here, just for those of y'all who are norm scholars. You'll also see folks talking about language, religious practices, etc. And so what's interesting about this is because culture is really inherent in the definition of ethnic group membership, anthropologists are just drawn right into thinking about ethnic groups. It comes up a lot, and in evolutionary anthropology, it's often what we mean by groups without even thinking about it, right? It's part of that lens we're bringing to the table. But of course, there are many other kinds of groups. And when we make explicit our kind of implicit assumptions about what groups are, that actually helps us theorize, and it helps us a little bit with our empirics too, as you'll see in my case. So when we think about what groups are, in evolutionary anthropology, we tend to be using one of these two different definitions, and maybe it'll be helpful for y'all too. So I'll go ahead and delineate. So one of the definitions that we're using, it's very common in primatology. It's very common in demography. It's also very common in social network analysis and some of the social sciences. And that is that individuals who are more connected to one another than to other people constitute a group. So this may be, for example, that they're spending more time with each other than with other individuals out in the world. This is often how primatologists are thinking about it. It may be that they're cooperating more with each other, so you see more resource flows within certain constellations of people than with others who are out there. And for demographers, it's often who you're marrying, right? So that constitutes a population, and that's often how we're thinking about groups. But of course, in other areas of the social sciences, we're often thinking about groups as identity groups, right? And that's where some of the descriptions from ethnic groups actually also come into play. We might be talking about identity markers, recognized shared origin, recognized shared experiences or languages. Those often are how we're thinking about groups in places like sociology. In cultural anthropology, for example, we do the same. And so these distinctions are important when we're thinking about intergroup conflict and about boundaries for reasons that I encountered in Bolivia. So when I was doing my PhD work, if we rewind, 10 years ago when I was doing that research, I was assuming group type 2. I was assuming identity groups, right? Given my training, given my background. This is partially not only from being an anthropologist, really attuned to culture, but also from being an American, where I heard that ethnic group identity was really central to Bolivia. And so as an American, where thinking about race and ethnicity is often at the forefront of the way we think about groups, I assumed it was going to structure people's worlds just as it did mine. But instead, I found something different. So first, let's start with this research question. So what I wanted to know is whether individuals with fewer resources showed more interest in cooperating with outgroup members. In other words, if you didn't have your needs met, if your household had less income than you needed, if you didn't have enough food to eat, were you more interested in connecting with members of other groups, being generous towards them, being friends with them? These are how I was operationalizing this question. But there's some assumptions in here that I want to unpack. So the first is that it assumes, importantly, that groups and resources have the same distribution. In other words, that if you don't have adequate resource access here, that means a group over there is going to have it. And that assumes that groups and resources are mapped onto the same places in the landscape. And I'll show you in a second what that means. So first thing, that means your neighbors can't help you. And second, it means that your neighbors are part of the same group that you are. Now, where was I getting this assumption? Where was it coming from? A lot of it was coming from maps like these. This is the one for Kenya. There's another one for Bolivia, but it actually maps ancestral lands for indigenous groups in Kenya and in Bolivia. Now, in Bolivia, the government was using this map to actually allocate resources. They were looking at what we call tierras de origen, so where you're from, to actually allocate resources to different indigenous groups. And so my brain was doing the same thing. It was assuming that people were distributed across the landscape. But I don't have to tell y'all that humans are not that straightforward, right? So first of all, it is true that resources are not evenly distributed across space. You might be in the US and you're looking for, I'll just pick one, places with adequate access to, wine. I'm from Napa. So You want wine, right? Not everywhere in the United States is going to grow good wine. That's okay, right? You have different resource distributions. Now, but that doesn't mean that everyone in Napa has the same identity group, right? And in Bolivia, it's the same thing. Even though the government was recognizing different pueblos indígenas located to different places on the map, people have been moving around forever. Folks in Bolivia have been displaced by the government in the past. We have folks who identify as Andinos, as being from the Andes, living in the lowlands. It's not so simple. And so what I ended up learning in Bolivia is that I was assuming group type 2, but in fact, group type 1 was really prevalent for people. In Bolivia, when people don't have adequate resource access, and think about parallels elsewhere in the world, what often happens is they build relationships with people who are in different places, right? Different parts of Bolivia, different parts of Latin America. And this is key in rural Bolivia to getting your needs met. So for example, finding a good job that pays well often involves knowing someone in a different country. Having access to cheap technology, if you want to have a smartphone, you actually need to know someone in the city. And if you want help with bureaucracy, if you don't know how to navigate that government paperwork, you need to know someone in the city. And so what I rapidly learned is that ethnic group membership was far more salient to the government and to me than it was to Bolivians living in rural spaces. And this is the group type 1 versus group type 2 distinction. You have these social networks that are regularly going across identity boundaries in Bolivia. And so this really helped me change my thinking. And this is something that if you're in political science, for example, we've known now for a good 20 years, right? There was this movement towards thinking about ethnic divisions in political science. Fractionalization was the word that was often used for it. And we've now moved long past that, right? We know that just because you have ethnic diversity doesn't mean you have ethnic conflict. They're not one and the same. So what we're instead thinking about here are these two different groups, these two different group types, and whether or not group boundaries are actually related to intergroup conflict depends on some other key ingredients. So let's talk a little bit about what those key ingredients are. Now, again, we're at the 30,000-foot view here, and we're going to look at some of those categories of things that tend to increase versus decrease intergroup conflict, but there's lots of particularities that I'm happy to unpack with y'all if you have questions and want to dive in. So if we're looking across what we've not only learned in evolutionary anthropology, but across the humanities, social sciences, and beyond, we often see three different kinds of buckets, if you will, of things that can increase and decrease intergroup conflict for humans. Now, the first one is this big bucket. I don't have to tell y'all. It's institutions. Now, these can be bottom-up emergent institutions, so norms, ways of doing things. Clusters of those norms can structure our social lives. You also get top-down versions as well. So governments, big religions, for example, can also structure our worlds. And you also can imagine, right, that institutions can structure whether or not intergroup relationships are things that can happen or not. So those can change how interactions go with outsiders. The second thing is resource access. Who has access to valued resources and who doesn't? What are perceptions about resource distributions, which we all know matter just about as much as the resource distributions themselves? And so we can think a little bit about who has what. And additionally, sometimes social information can actually be transmitted from person to person about past experiences with outgroup members, who has what, who doesn't. It can be really key, not only an individual's past experience in outgroup interactions. So in Bolivia, for example, one of the pueblos indígenas I was working with had regularly been stigmatized by other group members. And what that meant is that they had no interest, of course, in continuing those interactions. Goes without saying. And that's also something that can be transmitted from person to person. It's not worthwhile. Don't interact with this other group. It's not worth your time. So all three of these things can feed back on each other. One thing that's really interesting, of course, is when cultural institutions emerge that actually are built on past experience that then reduce the frequency of intergroup interactions when they haven't gone well before. So these three things, these big buckets, we've got institutions, we've got resource access, we've got past experience. In a way that my co-author, Cody Ross, and I think about, these are often upstream to a lot of things that are going on in the mind that then lead to behavior, that lead to some of this intergroup conflict. So we often see them as kind of occurring up here, upstream to internal states. So one thing I know we'll talk a lot about this afternoon are things like motivations. Mary Beth, you talked a little bit about that as well. It came up. What are people's preferences? How are they feeling internally about intergroup interactions, outgroup members in general? And this isn't just, of course, a function of our personality, like our political orientation, but also our past experiences, right? Also some of those institutions that are structuring our lives. Now, there's also some feedbacks in here with arrows, but you all get the idea. So as someone who studies cooperation, it may not surprise you to hear me say that I think that cooperation is at the core of all three of these categories. So institutions can increase or decrease the affordances of working together across group boundaries. In Bolivia, for example, the government wasn't making it easier for there to be positive interethnic interactions. Resource access or perceptions about it can really change dynamics. Who are the haves? Who are the have-nots? Do we have rampant inequality? And what have past experiences been like, right? It didn't go well. Why would I bother to continue to have these interactions? So whether individuals from two different groups are foes, friends, or frenemies depends on the affordances of these different interactions. If there's no opportunity for mutual benefit, for more benefit than there is cost, then we wouldn't expect people to continue to have those interactions. If there is, yeah, maybe everyone can be friends. And frenemies, this is of course a term y'all might have heard out in general discourse. I now feel a little bit old saying it. I know it's not common anymore, but this is when conditions change opportunities, right? So there may be different affordances in different contexts for being friends versus enemies, et cetera. And so the intergroup dynamic should really affect some of these affordances of cooperation. Now, I'm gonna give myself away here. I think that academics can certainly make contributions to basically work, whether that's academic work or non-academic work, to actually kind of take the temperature down and make it more possible to have intergroup interactions without having conflict. We can work with policymakers and change makers to do this. We can also, of course, work with innovators who want to do this. And this will be the theme for a lot of the rest of this afternoon. But here's what I think we can do, given what we know from evolutionary anthropology and given what we've kind of learned elsewhere in the social sciences and humanities as well. So here's the first thing. Let's go with the resource access bin. We can reduce perceptions or actual allocation of resources that are very zero-sum, right? So we have everything, you get nothing, or the perception that it's all or nothing. Either if I give some to you, then I'm not going to have anything left for myself. Now, what's really interesting about this, just so y'all know, coming from evolutionary anthropology, is humans are a great ape. You all probably knew that, right? And it ends up the great apes actually have the same kind of pattern. This is really interesting for me. We often thought people will look out at nature and say it's either, it's nature red and tooth and claw. Y'all know the expression. But the thing is that's really interesting is that if we look at bonobos, if we look at chimpanzees, other great apes, there's lots of flexibility in intergroup conflict. It can be high, it can be low, even in chimps that are really known for it. It can really be dialed down. And so I think something to keep in mind is if there are reasons to come together and not resources worth fighting for, it may sound simplistic, but this really works well in our closely related species, and it tends to work well in humans too. So the message from us is that nature is no excuse for intergroup conflict in humans. It's just as flexible in us as it is in the other great apes. Now, the second is opportunities for cooperation for mutual benefit. Those can build trust, and then trust can build opportunities for mutual benefit. This is the one that's going to be the theme of most of this afternoon, so I won't say too much here. But work that I've done on coastal Tanzania with fishers out there on the East African coast has really underscored that if you participate in shared governance of natural resources, that can build trust. And then trust can help, of course, in the governance of shared resources. Now, how does this work there? Very brief story. BMUs here stands for Beach Management Unit. And what is basically happening is that folks who are doing aquaculture, fishers, seaweed farmers, et cetera, if they trust that people in the next community over are going to do their part to manage the fishery, then I'm going to do it too. And if I have that trust, I'm more likely to contribute. And then if they do contribute, then I trust that they're going to do more in the future. And you get this really nice feedback loop. Really quintessential, of course, for collective action. And so if we see opportunities like this to scaffold up, we can always support that as academics and continue to study the fine-grained pieces of it that make that possible. And then finally, of course, institutional support matters, and it can start bottom up. Again, preaching to the choir here, but grassroots institutions can be really powerful for scaffolding cooperation across groups and dialing down intergroup conflict, regardless of the institutional type we're talking about here. But in the case of East Africa, again, I'll take you back to Tanzania, what we find is that oftentimes NGOs will come in. They'll have really good intentions, but they may not be there long, but they'll bring in ideas. And if what's working really well in one community, what we notice, of course, is people share information with each other. And that information sharing is often going between communities, from friends, from business partners, from families, but then communities adopt those institutions. They look at their neighbors and they're like, well, it's working really well over there. We want to try that here too. You can think about analogies in the United States, I'm sure. And so that institutional support can be bottom up. It can create institutions that break down boundaries between these communities. They then have shared institutions they can look to scaffold up additional cooperation, and it can help build that trust. So again, I might sound really glass half full about this when it comes to intergroup conflict in humans, but when there are opportunities like this, we can identify them and we can help support them, and we can also continue to study them to try to understand them. So in sum, human intergroup dynamics have always been flexible. It's not new. Our closest relatives have it. It's probably been present in the human lineage for a really long time. It's not all one, it's not all the other. Social connections across identity boundaries can be an important source of information sharing, cooperation, trust, collective action, and finding opportunities where we can recognize how those ingredients, institutions, resource allocation, past information, and how to kind of change people's experiences in positive ways by creating positive opportunities to work together can actually help us reduce the prevalence of intergroup conflict in humans. Again, that's a huge thing to say, but I still think that we can find little inroads there and continue to do that work. All right, thank you all for your time. If you want to see some more about this, feel free to check out my papers and would love to hear your questions. Thank you. How much time do I actually have for Q&A?
Like three to 5 minutes.
3 to 5 minutes, okay. I knew I'd go long. All right, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Hi.
Yeah.
That was fascinating and very rich, and a wonderful model of the evolution of cooperation along those several vectors. But I'm wondering, you mentioned in passing as an example of relaying past experiences as a variable. I'm wondering how much this sort of research applies to conflict resolution, where the past experiences are severe conflict, and could, just enlighten understandings of overcoming grievance, multi-generational grievance, and grievance that may cleave along ethnic or identity lines.
Yeah.
Is there any?
That's a great question. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat, there's folks in this room who have much more experience with this than me. So I'll start, but if you'd like to follow up, do feel free to do so. So the number one thing is being able to get people, of course, maybe not even in the same room, but in the same space where conversations can start to happen. And that already requires a lot of the through lines we've seen today. So it includes things like finding that common ground where we can all kind of agree on some ideas. I think a bit about our book discussion this morning, for example, about like what are the things we can all agree on, supporting human life, protecting human life. Those small things can be a way to actually get conversations started. But I think a lot of the time, and Kathy, you can check me on this, but it depends on how deep as well the harms have been. It can be really hard to get things started. A lot of the tools I'm talking about here are easier to do when the grievances are smaller, when the history is a bit smaller. And so it's something we can look to, but always finding that way to like start the conversation. What is the common ground? My understanding is that can be the hardest thing But this works well. So some of the tools I'm referencing here are tools that have been used, for example, to kind of bridge political boundaries in the US. Oftentimes, just getting folks to have that shared kind of cooperative interaction can make a big difference. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. This was a really interesting presentation. I have a probably weirdly simple question because I'm just generally curious about it.
Yeah.
How much of the, like, given people's beliefs and their circumstances, how much of the human intergroup conflict is rational, or the continuation of that of them is rational? I was just curious about it. What do you think about it?
I love also that you bring in the rationality, because I know in this room we could talk all day about rationality probably. Yeah, so one thing you might be picking up on here, and check me on this, is that the disciplinary background from which I come often has some of that economics in it. So like, what are the returns basically to intergroup interaction? So you get a little bit of that economics speak in there. So what's interesting, what we often do when we're thinking about the mind in evolutionary anthropology is we'll often think about kind of inputs and outputs. We take a lot of the cognitive psychology approach. And so we're thinking about what are the inputs in terms of rewards, like that interaction went well, and then the outputs, okay, let me readjust my priors about the world, and then I'm going to change my behavior. So if you're hearing that's what that is. So when you ask me about rationality, I guess the question is it rational to have that kind of real-time updating of priors? I'll leave that to many of y'all in this room who are better equipped to have that conversation. I'm hoping I'm answering your question, though. And my position on whether or not that's rational is, it depends on if you think that's rational. Does that help answer your question? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you.
So, see a question over there?
Yeah.
Get some steps in.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. It's actually a very quick question.
Yeah.
When you chose cooperation,
yes,
not collaboration, I'm curious.
That's a really good question. So my specialty is the evolution of cooperation. And when I say that, what I mean is that you're basically generating a benefit for someone else. It can be at a cost to yourself or not. And it doesn't necessarily have to be intentional. I'm going to use that word here in scare quotes because we can talk about what intention means. So collaboration still is a common goal. So we have a common goal. Cooperation, we don't necessarily have to have a common goal. So that's why I chose the word cooperation. Am I thinking about collaboration in the same way you are when I use the word and say it's a common goal thing? Okay. Yeah, so cooperation, you don't necessarily have to have that common goal. That's generating a benefit. I hope that helps. Yeah, okay, good. Good question.
I think one question that builds upon my student Farouk's question earlier.
Thank you.
So one thing across the three talks I'm noticing is like how to create situations that allow for the recognition of shared common pursuits.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of reducing the perception of zero-sum conflict. And I wonder, commonly, as I'm sure you're aware, I mean, like, how do we encourage people when they're entrenched in intergroup divisions? And how do we get people to be motivated to uptake information, to put themselves in situations where they learn about other framings that don't position something as a zero-sum conflict?
Right.
And I think of like Mary Beth and having selective exposure as one part of the media consumption model. I think of Ray's talk and like how to create situations where people could have pluralistic dialogue, but the willingness to be in that situation in the first place. So I'm just kind of curious if you have thoughts about how to encourage people to see different group conflict situations in non-zero-sum formats.
In a non-zero-sum context. Well, and at first, of course, we can think about structure and agency, just to bring in another fun concept. A lot of times the structure won't actually enable us to have those interactions. So in Kenya, for example, one thing we run into in northern Kenya is that interethnic tensions run so deep, you can't actually be in the same place. It's too dangerous, right? So that you can't have those conversations start. So what I think about when I'm thinking about Ray's work or Mary Beth's work is that in both cases, we're kind of building trust. And if I may, and I think Ray was alluding to this, we're building trust really quickly. There's something you're bringing to the classroom that is building trust really quickly. And And for Mary Beth, you're doing it kind of through messaging. And there's something about that elevation that's getting people to kind of really quickly go, oh, I'm feeling good. And now I'm open, right? So one thing I've heard about, and again, y'all in this room check me, so in the political science space or even in the community workspace, is oftentimes when there's something that's already bringing people together, you use that to basically piggyback on that, something where you're having a chance to have those conversations. In college classrooms, they have to come in anyway. So we have a captive audience and then we get to have those conversations. But oftentimes in community spaces, it may be that we're coming together over things like natural resources. One of my favorite things in PA that I've been thinking about, if y'all want to talk more, if you're from the Mid-Atlantic, or even if you're up in New York, is that we often have natural resource interests that actually cross the political divide really nicely. So in Pennsylvania, everyone kind of agrees that they want these big open green spaces. You can get folks to the table that way, but then we may have different priorities for what to do next if we're hunters or fishers or hikers, that type of thing. So oftentimes that's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about how we do this is first find something that is kind of low-hanging fruit for common ground, get folks in the same space, and then you can have those conversations. Again, a bit simplistic, but happy to chat more. I'm sure some of y'all have really good ideas.